Kia ora and welcome to the Niggly Niche Cast. I am the Diggity Doodah Doc, aka Lord Slippers of the... I like the sunshine, so we might say Lord Slippers of somewhere deep in dawn. And I'm here with the wildcard to talk through Game of Thrones, Season 8, Episode 6, I believe. All done, all wrapped up. No more Game of Thrones telly for the foreseeable future at least. And me and the wildcard, we pop up after every episode to talk through Game of Thrones. To support the Niche Case, jump on Patreon or just support us any other way that you feel fit. We're always grateful for the support while we just serve up these shenanigans that we love to do. And wildcard, We'll get deep into this finale of Game of Thrones. There's lots of different wrinkles, nooks and crannies to explore, but for me the most important one is how did old Robin Arryn get so buff and masculine and so cool? He was sitting there at the council and he was just like the epitome of a, alpha kind of jockey male, which is very different to the last time we saw him. So how the fuck are you? And do you have any explanation for Robin Arryn's
transformation?
Borderline steroid usage.
Yeah, bloody good, mate. I've got I think there's a pretty obvious solution here. You remember how Tormund got so big?
All that milk that isn't supposed to be drunk by humans, I believe, Wildcat.
That was the one, being breastfed by a giant. So you might remember little Lord Arryn back in the day getting breastfed when he was like 12 years old still. So, I mean, we thought it was creepy at the time, but apparently, I don't know, maybe that, at least it was actually human milk as well this time. Maybe there's just health benefits we never realized there.
How so?
Well, look at the bugger.
Yeah,
Look at him compared to when we last saw him.
I see more as that of one of the flaws in what we witnessed in the season finale, because that council had Robin Arryn just suddenly looking buff, and then you had Mr. Tully, Edmure Tully, who last I remember was still captured. He was a prisoner, and then suddenly he makes a play at the throne and everyone kind of shuts him down. Like, it was just an awkward, weird addition to a situation where we had a lot of people at that council who no explanation, no information about how they, who they were, or how they got there, what they were doing there. It was, for me, all the, I don't want to use issues, but just the queries and questions about the season finale, a lot of them stem back to that council meeting where you had Robin Arryn suddenly looking buff. You had Edmure Tully miraculously there, and the weird situation where he makes a play at being the king, which I just found super weird to even include that. And then suddenly Tyrion is solving the situation as a prisoner, and Grey Worm's just confused. He can't do anything. And from that, Jon's banished to the wall, and it's just everything's a bit of a kerfuffle at that council meeting. And to me, that kind of summarized my feelings of the season finale.
See, I think I was a lot higher on the season finale than you were. I get what you're saying about the council meeting. There was some elements of that which were a bit odd. I remember Edmure being sort of held as a semi-captive of the Freys because he married a Frey girl. In fact, was it his wedding was the red? I can't remember. But he had some house or other. I mean, all the Freys are dead now, so maybe he owns the Frey house. Maybe that's it. And you did have a bunch of other people that don't have that just didn't get their backstories. And there were even unnamed people. Like there was a Prince of Dawn who we don't know who that is because all the Sand Snakes and the other dude pretty much all dead at this point. There was the mother of the Sand Snakes still. I think Ilaria was her name. as far as I know, she was still in the what do you call them, like the prison cells in King's Landing. So I'm just gonna assume that she either died in between seasons or, didn't make it out of the rubble. But you had other people who just didn't seem to have, we just didn't have an explanation to why they were there. But I sort of took that as part of the main moral I took from this episode, which is that we witnessed the end of a story. We witnessed the closing of a book, and figuratively in terms of watching a TV show here, but also literally, Brienne shutting the book on finishing Jaime's story and then shutting the book there, turning to the page to a blank one. The next story begins here. It's probably her story. I'm assuming she's now the head of the Kingsguard for Bran Stark, for King Brandon the Broken. There was a twist. So the next story is her story. The next story is Bran the King's story. The next story is Tyrion is Hand of the King now, and Arya going west of Westeros, and Sansa is Queen of the North. These are the next stories, but they're not, our stories. They're the stories that happen unwritten beyond the story that we've been told, beyond the page, beyond the TV show. We can imagine them. We can try to predict what would happen, but those stories are unwritten. They're untold. And I guess a lot of those people at their council meeting, they had untold stories, they had unwritten stories, and I think the perspective of the world, I don't think they landed this entirely, but I like to think that this is what they were trying to get at, was that we've seen Jon Snow's story rising from, bastard without a place to Lord Commander of the Night's Watch to heir to the Iron Throne to savior of humanity, back to Lord Commander of the Night's Watch again. Didn't look like there was much of a Night's Watch there to command, to be fair, but whatever. We've seen, Bran's story from broken, crippled child to three-eyed raven to now king of I guess it's only the Six Kingdoms, etc., 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 all these other stories. Those are the stories that we watch. Those are the stories that we know. We don't know Edmure Tully's story because we only saw him when he overlapped with the main characters that we've been following over the time. Uncle Ed tried to get a play at the throne. He stood up and made his best speech, and Sansa told him to just sit back down again because his is not our story, you know what I mean? And there was some sort of meta-textual allusions to the whole storytelling aspect, which I think I quite enjoyed, except for that bit about the book, which they decided to call Song of Ice and Fire, which was just way too, on the nose. But yeah, I guess that's the deal with a lot of the other council stuff. What I didn't like about the council is how, A, they didn't explain why only Grey Worm was there representing all the powers that are supposedly going on, and Jon was not there even though Tyrion was there, and they're both prisoners, and Jon doesn't get a say, but somehow Tyrion gets to basically decide who the entire next king is. Why is Grey Worm letting these lords of the lands who he's just conquered decide who the next monarch is? And obviously he'd checked out by that point. I think we came to realize he was just ready to go home, but whatever. There's some stuff there they didn't quite explain. I think with Jon, I had to figure this out on my own afterwards. It's why didn't they just kill Jon on the spot? Why wasn't Tyrion murdered on the spot? I think Tyrion wasn't murdered on the spot because Jon sort of pleaded for him, and then Dany got killed before she could give an order. But as for Jon, you would assume that Grey Worm would have just executed him on the spot. He did exactly that with those Lannister lords at the start of the episode, but I think the problem there, and they didn't do a very good job of explaining this, but I think the logic is that there was a power struggle without Daenerys there. There was a gap where you had the Unsullied and the Dothraki, who apparently the Dothraki are just all alive again. I don't know if they got resurrected, but it looked like they all got pretty thoroughly murdered in the Battle of Winterfell, but whatever. And you had that army who all wanted Jon dead, but you also had all the Northerners who are completely loyal to Jon, who would have, started another war if they'd killed Jon. So there was sort of a power struggle there, which I think is why Jon got to stay as a prisoner rather than being executed, and eventually they compromised by releasing him. Although, again, I don't see why Tyrion got a full pardon and Jon didn't, but I guess the reason was so that Tyrion would end up as Hand of the King and Jon would end up back on the Night's Watch where they both sort of belong. So, I don't know. Were you satisfied with the overall ending?
Oh shit, no.
No? Bran on the throne?
Not at all. But I'm walking a fine line because I don't like the idea of fans and the audience going down the route of like, what did they do to my show? What did they do to my character?
Right. 100%.
That's ridiculous because we're just all watching a creation from other people and how other people interpret a very difficult and unique situation given the show and the book and the lack of crossover to where we are now. Like, it's a very unique situation, and so anything that you disagree with is kind of because of your own perception, your own belief of what should have happened, whereas you're not writing it, you're not doing it, so that's ridiculous. But I definitely, it was a bit crazy, some of the stuff that happened. Like, not a fan at all of Jon. I'm pretty much not a fan of any of the outcomes. I'm not a fan of Jon going back to the Wall. Like, that's just like, Jon did all of that. Like, Jon went through the absolute fucking ringer. He was put through just all sorts of crazy situations, and just to end up going back to the Wall, I don't really understand why Bran. The whole idea of Bran was the dissolving of Bran Stark. Like, Bran Stark got dissolved, and we were told numerous times, point blank, the various reintroductions between Bran and his siblings and just different people, different interactions that Bran had. We were told numerous times that Bran is just at this point, he's just a vehicle. He's just a vehicle to set things in motion, and the idea of him being a person, the idea of him being an actual living creature, we were told directly that was over. So for Bran, someone who barely wanted to be King of Winterfell, to suddenly have a desire, and he did, because he said, that's why I came here, as if he knew it was already going to happen, typical Bran fashion. For Bran to suddenly have that desire to want to be King of Westeros, like, that's a bit weird. And Sansa, she's the Queen of Winterfell, but even the fact that she had to ask Bran if the North could be a separate entity to the Kingdom of Westeros, so it's 6 kingdoms instead of 7. Like, you've got to ask your brother for that. Like, surely Bran would just say, nah, the North used that. You like surely Bran would instigate that instead of Sansa being in an awkward situation where she has to ask Bran for the privilege of the North. Like, you two are brother and sister. You realize that. And then Tyrion. I think we got far too much of Tyrion in this episode. I think it was too Tyrion-centric, to put it a certain way. Like, the fact that Tyrion was the one, as a prisoner, making pretty much all the decisions was kind of ridiculous. And then Tyrion finding Jaime and Cersei dead, perfectly nestled under a pile of rocks. That was also a bit weird. What else did we have?
Quite a few things.
Yeah, and then Arya just going off to the west. Like, that's a cool thing. Like, we know that's within Arya's character. But her kind of arc after killing the Night's King just went into oblivion. Like, the 5th episode ended with Arya jumping on this white horse, and everyone's like, what does that mean? What does this represent? It represented nothing. Like, it literally meant nothing. She just rode the horse out, and then suddenly we're in the aftermath of what we're doing. Like, it didn't symbolize anything because it didn't actually result to anything. And then suddenly Arya's just, I'll just go off west. And yeah, so those are just a few. And that, as you said, like suddenly there's heaps of Dothraki and Unsullied. Well, pretty sure when we watched the Battle of Winterfell, everyone got fucked up. There wasn't exactly, like the Dothraki literally rode into death. But there's still some who survived. Like, we were wondering how main characters survived. But all these other characters that we presumed died because the situation was so perilous, they're all alive. And it's just like, wow, what's going on here? And then suddenly you've got Bronn as the master of finances. It might be a bit funny, like, Bronn, he's such a character, he's such a joker. He's master of finances. Ha ha ha. He likes brothels. Ha 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 ha. What? You're putting a sellsword as the master of finances? Just wow. Just a whole lot of like moves and choices that didn't really make a lot of logical sense from my perspective. If I've missed any out, just feel free to remind me.
Oh, I mean, there's the whole thing with Drogon picking up the body and flying away, and just conveniently exiting the story at that point where they didn't. I mean, I was looking at that thinking he's not going to kill Jon, and then I thought for a second, maybe he is going to kill Jon, and then I thought, he won't kill him. He's a Targaryen. He knows he wrote his brother. He should be all good here. Then he destroys the Iron Throne, which is lovely and symbolic and a beautiful shot. And I think a lot of what you're saying there, having those Dothraki alive meant that they could have that very Nazi-esque, Hitler rally from Daenerys, although we at least got that scene with her and Jon before he killed her where we saw her point of view finally. Like, they gave her a bit of sympathy, which was very much needed at that point with that character. But yeah, then the dragon just flies off at the point where I'm like, okay, Dany's dead. I can see the end point of the show now. Presumably, Jon is going to be the new king. That's what I thought at that point anyway. And I thought, well, if I'm Jon, the first thing I'm doing is having this dragon executed because we can't have that kind of power in this realm anymore. We've seen the damage that it does. Ultimate power is ultimately corrupting. So, that was the lesson of Daenerys, who we thought she was going to be like a rags to riches Cinderella tale at the start. It turns out she was Tony Montana Scarface. So, okay, whatever. As for Bronn got to be Master of Finance because he has all the money now. Because he bargained Tyrion into giving him Highgarden, which, is the old Tyrell stronghold, which meant that he has all the cash. So, yeah, he sort of bargained, but it's not an ideal one. Like, watching that scene also reiterated that thing I was feeling about the storytelling aspect of this, where like these stories are not finished. They're gonna continue. They're gonna have wars to fight in the future, and there's gonna be conflict and drama, and we're not gonna be witness to that, but it presumably would happen within this fictional realm here. And Bronn being Master of Finance was one of the first things I thought, because I'm like, this just isn't going to end well. He's a dude who's never had, he's literally a mercenary. He's never had this much money in his life, and he will not know what to do with it. He's going to cause some trouble there, methinks, and several other characters. I mean, just Bran as the king. Dude checked out of that council meeting within 5 seconds based on the first topic of mention. He's like, has anyone seen the dragon? No? Okay, I'll go find him. And then that's it. And then Tyrion has his entire list of things. We've got to feed the people. We've got to do this. We've got to rebuild the brothels. We've got to do that. And I think Tyrion is pretty much king by proxy in that situation, which, hey, fine. He's probably one of the most capable leaders there. Surprised he survived that episode as well, to be honest, like some of them. But I don't know. I liked a lot of the way they dealt with the story, and that they didn't wrap it up. They gave characters fairly definitive roles, but they also spent a bit of time after the big climax of Jon shanking Dany one last time, and they gave us half an hour, probably more than that afterwards, of wrap up time. and it was very Lord of the Rings in terms of how long it took, and it was extremely Lord of the Rings when you had like John waiting to get on the boat saying goodbye to his family, just like Frodo and the other hobbits at the end of that. You had the book at the end written by one of the characters within the show, named after that's exactly what happened at the end of Lord of the Rings too. And I quite like that they spent enough time to set up that there is a lot more to follow in this world, and that these characters aren't dead. They've got troubles and things they're going to have to deal with down the line. It's just that the show's finished, and this is where, like, the train's pulled into the station, and this is where we get off. Having said that, I also thought, like, I guess this is coming back to what I said about the council thing before as well, because all these characters there that we don't actually know who we see are actually rather important, reminded me of two things. One was that when, oh man, this was the worst part of the show as well for me, was when Sam stood up and said, why don't we let the people vote on it? And I thought for a second that we were going to get this incredibly stupid American point of view where it's like, the only way to go is a free and open democratic election. No one would ever elect a narcissistic tyrant, fascist leader with an open democratic election. It's like, well, coming from a show made in America in the year of 2019, I thought that would have been just an unbelievably terrible way to go. But thankfully, everyone laughed him out of the room. And then you had this thing where it was like, that also reminded me that for all the talk about the realm and all the people that are, going to be ruled over and all this, and how many people this decision affects, who becomes the new king and all that, we literally did not see a single peasant or plebeian or anything like that in this. Like, we saw no sign of the greater world beyond, other than a couple of stray leaders. And that made me think, like, if I lived in this world, don't think I'd want to be a soldier, because not really my type. If I had the ideal role, I think it would be someone like Tyrion, who just gets to use his words and his wit to get out of situations. And I don't think I'd get to be that either, though, because Tyrion is highborn, so like 99.9% chance that I wouldn't be that. So like, what would I do in this world? I don't know. I'd like run a bloody potato farm in the Midlands somewhere, like somewhere by the Reach or something. I don't know. I'd just like a nice ecologically sustainable potato farm, sweet as. And I thought, well, if I was in the middle there, like not too north to be freezing and old Winterfell snow, not too south to be too close to King's Landing and dangerous, I'm like, if I was living that life at this time, this entire show would have passed me by. Like the Battle of Winterfell, I would have had nothing to do with that, too far south to be involved. Battle of sacking of King's Landing, too far north to be involved. I would have fallen under a different house other than Lannister or Stark. Presumably there would in this world be thousands and thousands of people who just went about their daily life the whole time and had absolutely nothing to do with any of these stories. And one day they're going to go to the marketplace and someone's going to say, hey, did you hear that crippled Stark boy's the new king? And they'll be like, whoa, bloody hell, what do you know? Back about my life, nothing's changed.
Very interesting idea there. I would you've got to be someone who offers service. So you've got to be a blacksmith, you've got to be a chef or farmer or someone who has benefit to other people. But then, like, when you're talking about that, I just remember the stories of the mountain just walking around the Riverlands, just destroying everything. Like, just prior to Game of Thrones kind of starting, I think it is, where the mountain's just walking around under the orders of Tywin Lannister, just destroying everything in his path. And so even if you're a farmer out in the Wops, you're going to come across some nasty people. And we've seen it numerous times in the show where people are just at their house and then other people show up and rape the daughters and just be on their merry way and ransack everything. So I'd rather just not exist in that world, personally.
Well, yeah, that's the ultimate preference.
Yeah.
Stay away from the King's Road as well. I think that's pretty clear.
Oh, well away. And definitely do not live inside King's Landing. That is a cesspit of...
I don't think anyone does anymore.
No, that is correct, Wildcard. So many ideas just flowing through my head. What you said about Bron, like I just find it weird that the person with a lot of money is the master of finances. Like, surely you've got to display like a knowledge and a fondness, not a fondness, like a expertise in money. But an interesting idea. What the show did do was break the wheel. And if we're operating from that premise of the whole idea of pretty much everything, like it was Daenerys's catchphrase, but I think everyone who was a good person had the idea of breaking the wheel. And that's ultimately what happened from a broad perspective. The wheel has been broken in the sense that Bran, he can't have any more kids. He can't have kids, so he can't start that process. Now we've got the democracy. So that's kind of cool. You know, that the idea of breaking the wheel applied heavily in this last season, to the point where the person who had the catchphrase of breaking the wheel fell victim to that idea. Like, if you're not going to really try and break the wheel, you're not really worthwhile in the storyline. So Daenerys was all about breaking the wheel, but when she turned into the wheel, it became a very, dangerous situation. And what I kind of settled in the 48 hours after watching that season finale was a bit of a crisis as to why I liked Game of Thrones, because the last season was like a journey for me, with each episode increasing in stuff that I didn't like or I didn't enjoy, or that I saw as diverting away from what I really liked about Game of Thrones to start with. You kind of take it back to season 7, primarily when the show had to move beyond the books that were already published. So you kind of came at it from that perspective, so you've got a bit more history in that line of thinking. But what I missed, or what was lacking in much of the final season, it was and again, like, I don't want to mention the time and being rushed, because that just seems like such a cliche answer right now. But
I think it's the right answer, though.
That was exactly what I enjoyed about Game of Thrones, was the details and the depth of the world. The world was the whole Game of Thrones world that we were transplanted in was kind of took on from the world building element of George R. R. Martin in the stories, where there's so many details, so much history, which is absolutely crazy when you like, if anyone out there wants to write like a fantasy novel, try that world building bit first before you start writing, and you'll realize what a ridiculous task that is. But in the show, in the early seasons, you got so much of that depth. Like, you really understood where a lot of the characters were coming from. There was an effort into every character. There was a seed planted, then we saw that seed planted, and we saw the reward, or the result of why we were invested in that character. There was, multiple character arcs, there was multiple storylines, there was multiple feelings, but it was the depth of everything that really got me invested. And when you look at that last season, it was the lack of depth that just felt a bit strange. And that's why I feel the way I do about that council ceremony, because that was a situation where you had fantastic opportunity for just a sliver of depth to be reinstated, and maybe in my mind, to kind of save the season. Like, if you just had a little bit more depth to that council, I'd feel much more content as a fan. Instead, that council kind of turned into an example of the complete lack of depth, and it was just, the reason, in a long-winded way, the reason I loved Game of Thrones, the TV show, was because of the depth of the world of Game of Thrones. And instead of concerning myself about how that was missing in the last season, now I just understand why I like Game of Thrones so much, because of the depth. And it doesn't really matter what the last season dished up. It's more about understanding what it was about the whole TV show in its entirety that drew me in, and forced me to be such a... I'm not a hardcore fan of a lot of like pop culture, but Game of Thrones definitely caught me up in a storm. And it's just all about the depth of the characters, the world, the stories, the nuances of different relationships. All of that just drew me in to such an extent.
Yeah, I could hardly agree with you more on that point. I think that is the main... And I do think it is because they rushed it. And like from accounts, HBO said, do you want full seasons? We'll give you 10 episodes, even if you want to make them longer. Who cares? Like, this is our golden egg here. Do what you want. And they said, no, just 6 episodes. 7 in season 7, 6 in season 8, and that's all we need. And it wasn't all they need. They should have spread it out and taken their time and just maintained a level of like... I don't even know if they could have maintained that level, because they had to wrap it up in some way or another, and they couldn't just keep expanding on the world. But at the same time, definite feeling, I think I said like one of the last episode or the episode before, that it just feels like this world has shrunken so much and we haven't been introduced to a new relevant character for about 2 seasons, which is about like 3 years time now, since we saw someone, and we saw a bunch of them at the council where we could have. At least it was an indication that there is a world beyond the characters that we've like really streamlined towards as everyone. And it's like we lost the case of setting as well, where Dany was over there, Jon was up there, Sansa was somewhere in the middle, Cersei's down here. Everyone converged on the same place, and everything just... It did shrink. It had to shrink to a point, and I think they at least acknowledged afterwards that there's a bigger, wider world that, the pieces need picking up now and putting back together. But I was disappointed that they didn't show anything at all about, like, the wider perspective. And I would have opened that episode... I mean, I like the way they opened it with walking through the rubble, but I would have, at least at some point in that episode, had, like... the impact this has on the people of Westeros. Like, there was nothing of that, and it was crazy. But it wasn't just this episode, it was all season. It was ever since they went off the books, I would argue. Like, it's almost like they felt like they didn't have the right to be inventing or chucking in relevant characters, but they didn't draw from the ones that were already there either. Like, there was just a lot of stuff that was left behind, a lot of things unanswered. I think some of that was deliberate, like just to leave things open-ended, because I think that was what they were trying to do with the finish, but they did need a little bit more of that world building, because they really shrunk it down over the last... It's not just this season, the last couple seasons. But having said that, I thought the first 2 episodes of this season, and probably not a coincidence then that the second one was the best of them, where it was a capsule episode where we're only focusing on the characters who are in Winterfell right now. But I thought the first 2 episodes were brilliant. Second one was like 11 out of 10 great. Battle for Winterfell had its problems, but as a visual spectacle, fantastic. In fact, the visual spectacle thing lasted the whole way through, and I think a lot of the issues with not explaining things and like, having things that didn't quite make sense, a lot of it was either... like, it wasn't their big decisions. I think Dany becoming Mad Queen could have been dealt with better if they'd had an extra episode in there, but I don't think it was as out of the question as people seem to be thinking, like it's this big travesty, this disaster of writing. I don't think that's true. I think it's been teased from the very start that this is a possibility. I just don't think they quite explained it as well as they could have. But having said that, like, the real problem with the writing was not the way they. It's not the way they did their big things, it was the way they linked them together, just like the in-betweens, like having Danny travel and lose a dragon on the way because this guy's got a thunderbolt and he hit the dragon 3 times in a row from there, but then when he's actually got one flying straight at him, he can't hit it at all. Like, silly things which were just convenient, and they were convenient because they were trying to get A from here, like they were trying to get person from A to B in a certain way in order to arrange things for the big spectacles later on, and yeah, there was... It was that stuff of convenience that was an issue. But I think when it comes to criticizing the writing, like you already said, how dumb it is to feel like you have ownership over the way a show is written. It's not your vision, it's someone else's vision. Like, let them see their creative vision through to the conclusion they think it deserves. Like, you don't get to have a say in it. Petitioning to rewrite the series is beyond stupid. But I think with this, it's just this weird and completely unique situation where you've got a show adapted from a book, not at all controversial that happens all the time, but you've got a show adapted from a book which then moved beyond the book. Okay, a little more rare, but again, it still happens. As quite often shows will make a sequel that is completely invented or whatever, or will expand on what we've got to make something more. But the difference here is that the books weren't finished. And there hasn't been a new book since the show started. So, they're working off an imagined script, and they've got details from George R. R. Martin who's told them things, and I don't think his books are going to be as different from the show ending as some people would think, but I do think his books will be a lot better at explaining them and keeping perspectives, and there are certain storylines that never got touched, which... almost to the detriment of the show. I understand why you can't do everything, but yeah, there's some stuff in there that, like Young Griff, I think we missed out on Young Griff, but don't want to get into all that right now. Just like the fact that they had to go off the book, and now the fact that people were watching the show knowing that there is still a book to come, and that if they don't like this ending, perhaps there'll be a better one. It already puts in people's minds the idea that there is an alternative to what you're about to see. And I don't think there's another grand TV show of this scale that ever had to deal with that problem before. And, it is a problem because you've got people already in their minds that something else is out there, so they think, well, if there's an alternative to this, why can't there be an alternative to that? So why can't we just rewrite this and do, George R. R. Martin's going to rewrite it, so why can't we there's an element of ownership that people should not have at that point. But I think there's also an element of just like feeling like it's a possibility, and they shouldn't, but it's sort of part and parcel with just this weird situation of adapting a book that hasn't been written yet.
Which puts everything in an interesting position, considering I think for a lot of people, the major winner here is the books.
Yeah, that's fair to say, but the book is always better.
All the people who were involved in the reading of the books before, now they're heavily invested in the books and waiting for George R. R. Martin to come back with another book. People like me, who reached a certain level of Game of Thrones fandom, but were slightly left wanting more, now we are, I'm excited to see the book, and I'd rather get deeper into the books than get into a prequel kind of show. And I think, I don't know, just the anti kind of capitalistic nature of why there will be spin-offs of Game of Thrones, that's just purely a financial decision. And yeah, I just can't see how those will capture the world's imagination like Game of Thrones did, knowing like how we feel about this season, the last season. And I think people will now be drawn to the books for that fix and for getting more information. You said that the books probably won't diverge too much from the show, and that's, whether that's true or not doesn't really matter, because I think, I don't know if anyone else feels like me, but I want to even if the books have the same ending, I'm going to feel a whole lot more comfortable with how it's set up, and again the depth of how that plays out.
Yeah, well, yeah, they because the context behind them and the fact that just the method of storytelling, telling them from each chapter is from a different character's perspective, so you get the inner monologues, which are so important for conflicted characters like Jaime's the obvious one, but even Tyrion, and Bran, to be honest. Like, I think book Bran is a lot more interesting than show Bran, who, remember, was it season 4 or 5? He literally sat the whole thing out. Like, he was benched for an entire season because it's too hard to come up with stuff for him to do. he was being dragged around by old Mira. Pour one out for Mira. If she isn't, like, I think he owes her at least a bouquet of flowers and an apology at this point for the way he brushed her off. Never got anything from the Reed family, actually. I was hanging out for old Howland Reed to pop back up at some point. But, these are things that we're way more likely to get details of in the book just because there's scope for so much more. And having that different perspective of being able to tell it from characters' point of views helps massively as well. And getting to, like, how different... It's impossible to do this in a film because you have to watch things happen from a depth to be able to see it. But Daenerys' mindset, if we could go inside her brain at the point where she decided to sack King's Landing, would just have been so much more rewarding than what we got, even though I think, what we got was a lot better than the way it's been perceived by a lot of people. But, I read the Duncan Eck books recently as well, like within the last couple weeks, and cool books, like fun, enjoyable, relatively simple reads, which is all they're trying to be. They're just 3 short novels. I thought there would be a little more, like, I was reading for clues about what might happen here, and there was nothing of that sort, but it did remind me, just like, even in this simplistic, relatively, compared to the Song of Ice and Fire novels, like, even in this setting, which isn't anywhere near as deep as the other ones, like, I still felt like this was a world that I was inhabiting while I'm reading this, which is that whole thing about world building again, which we sort of lost in this last season. But, I still want to reiterate that I thought the last season was mostly, I was going to say excellent. I think episode 4 and 5 detracted quite a bit from that idea of excellent, so I would say mostly great. Started off fantastic, dropped off. I liked the finale a lot better than you did by the sounds of it, so I think that was, a pass mark from my point of view. I think overall great visual spectacle, lots of things that went great with this. It's just a matter of how much we want to get hung up on the things that didn't make sense, and that's a different perspective for every person, isn't it? Because it's a fantasy world, you're supposed to live inside this thing, and the things that don't make sense are the things that take you out of it. And once you're out of it, you notice more, and that's when people start scoping for, like, plastic water bottles hidden behind people's feet and stuff like that. Coffee cups on tables.
I think we can wrap it up there. I just got one more idea. You did mention Mira Reed and Bran Stark. Bran just feels like a dick right now.
He's a bit selfish, isn't he?
When you think about what happened and how he said goodbye to Mira Reed and everything that happened for Bran on this journey, for him to just come out and say, I want to be king, which he kind of effectively did, that's it feels to me like a pretty big diversion from his character.
Who would you have put on the throne instead? Jon? Because I was prepared for it to be Jon.
Well, if you're the whole premise is about breaking the wheel, I think you come in with a
no king at all, just have a council.
A council for the time being until shit gets sorted out. Like, I don't think there's really a need for someone to come out and be king while you're sorting those things out. And I think they did that, but they did it in a very lazy way by making Bran the king, because Bran is essentially nothing.
He's an ineffective king. He's clearly going to be an ineffective king.
But the whole, like, yeah, I go back to this Bran idea to kind of summarize my whole feeling. Like, up until the last episode, Bran was, his whole story had been about him becoming nothing.
Could say a similar thing about Arya too. But she didn't become queen, I guess. So.
Yeah, and she didn't, like, she kind of stuck to her going west of Westeros is essentially who Arya Stark is.
Yeah, agreed.
Like, to
it's true
her
to
core.
her character.
Whereas Bran just coming out and like, well, that's why I'm here. Like, bro, like, what?
Isn't it? You could have told someone, Bran. You could have told someone. Maybe he told Tyrion, because there was a secret, there was a conversation he had with Tyrion in episode 2, I think, which we never saw. It cut away as he said, I've got time. I'll have a seat. Tell me a story. I guess that was more previewing the fact that it was his story that gave Tyrion the reason to hire him, which comes back to that idea about storytelling being important. But yeah, maybe we should just wrap it up at that, or we'll be here all day.
We'll be here all day indeed, Wildcard. And to be honest, I just want some space from Game of Thrones for now. Like, it's just taking up too much of my... to be honest, I'm happy this last season's over. I'm happy to now be in a position to look forward to the books. And I'm just happy to step away from Game of Thrones for a second and, not concern myself with all these characters.
Fair enough.
Roger that, Wildcard. I will not be stepping away from the Niche Cage, though. That's still got lots of glorious content to come out with. So we'll be back in the coming days with another episode of the Niche Cast. There'll be a rugby league episode coming out imminently, and we might have to talk through some footballing matters, Wildcard.
Yeah, I suppose they could be on the agenda. We got Under-20 World Cup starts on Saturday morning, which I think there's a high hopes that our team could do extremely well there. Of course, the big one is the Women's World Cup in June, couple weeks. Concurrent with the Cricket World Cup, so how good are those early mornings and late nights going to be?
Always good to wake up and be up and active early, as they say.
Yep.
Radio Wildcard, we'll wrap it up there. Kia kaha, all the beautiful people out in the world, and see you later.